The moment I walked into that conference room at Hargrove and Associates, my son stopped mid-sentence. His mouth stayed open just long enough for everyone at that table to notice. The estate attorney looked up from his papers, and I watched the color leave his face. Not slowly, all at once, like someone had pulled a plug. My daughter-in-law gripped the armrest of her chair. "That's her," the attorney said, barely above a whisper. "That's actually her." Nobody in that room understood what those words meant, but I did. I had spent 69 years being underestimated. I knew exactly when the tide was about to turn. Every morning in Mill Haven, Vermont started the same way for me. I rose before 6, put the kettle on the old gas stove that my husband had insisted we keep even when everything else in the kitchen got updated, and stood at the window watching the birch trees at the edge of the yard. My husband, Bernard, had planted those trees the year our son was born. 34 years later, they were taller than the house. I liked watching them in the early light. It was the quietest part of my day. And after Bernard passed, it became the part I held on to most carefully. People in town knew me as the retired school librarian with the blue mailbox and the rose bushes that got a little out of hand every June. I had been a part of Mill Haven for most of my adult life. I had organized the summer reading program for 22 years. I had made soup for half the families on our street when someone had a baby or lost a parent. I was not a woman people looked at twice. That was fine by me. Bernard always said I had a gift for being invisible until the exact moment it mattered. I just hadn't known how true that was until everything fell apart. My son drove up on a Thursday in late October with his wife and a folder tucked under his arm that he kept touching, the way people touch things they're nervous about. I had made pot roast because it was his favorite, and I'd set the table with the linen cloth I saved for occasions. I thought maybe this was one of those check-in visits that had become more frequent since Bernard died. I thought maybe he'd finally bring up the grandchildren more, ask how I was sleeping, stay for dessert. He set the folder on the table before he even took off his coat. "Mom," he said, "we've been talking, and we think it's time." His wife stood slightly behind him, close to the wall, looking at the wallpaper pattern instead of my face. "Time for what?" I asked. I knew. Something in the way he'd said "we've been talking," not "I've been thinking," or "I wanted to ask you," told me this had been decided somewhere I wasn't invited. "The house is too much for one person. You're alone up here. The winter's hard. There's a wonderful place in Burlington, assisted living, beautiful grounds, all your meals taken care of." He slid the folder across to me. Inside was a glossy brochure with a photograph of elderly people doing a craft project, all of them smiling the particular smile of people who have been told to smile. I closed the brochure. I said, "Your father built the bookshelves in this house with his own hands. I have 20 years of good health left in me, God willing, and I am not going anywhere." My son sighed. My daughter-in-law finally looked at me, and the expression on her face wasn't concern. It was impatience, the kind you feel when a project is taking longer than expected. "Mom, you fell last winter." "I fell once, on ice, because the de-icer was in the garage and I forgot to bring it out. That isn't a diagnosis." She spoke then for the first time. "We're not asking you to disappear. We just want what's best for you." She said it pleasantly, and I noticed she did not say what was best for me was staying in my home. My son reached across the table and patted my hand the way you pat the hand of someone you've already decided things for. "We'll come back next week," he said. "Give yourself time to think it over." They did not stay for pot roast. My daughter-in-law had already eaten, she said. She was watching her sodium. After their headlights disappeared down the long driveway, I stood at the kitchen sink and ran the hot water over my hands for a long time. Not because they were cold, just because I needed something to do that wasn't crying. The following week, they came back with a man in a suit who introduced himself as a real estate consultant. He walked through my rooms with a clipboard and made notes I wasn't invited to read. He tapped the crown molding Bernard had put up and said it was dated. He stood in the doorway of my husband's study and said the square footage was inefficient for the market. My neighbor Audra came to the back door with zucchini from her garden. She took one look at the man with the clipboard and looked at me with a question in her eyes. I shook my head slightly. She left the zucchini on the counter and whispered that she was right next door. The real estate consultant left a card with a number. My son said they could have things moving by spring if we got started now. His wife suggested I might want to begin going through Bernard's things, as the buyers would likely want the house empty. That was the word that cut the deepest. Empty. I said I would think about it. I would not think about it. But saying so bought me time, and time was what I needed. 3 days later, I was looking for the deed to the property. I wanted to see exactly what was in my name, exactly what belonged to me. When I found the box, it was in the back of Bernard's closet, behind his winter coats, inside a larger box of what looked like old tax records. A metal lockbox, gray, with a combination I didn't know. I sat on the edge of the bed and held it in my lap for a long time. Then I went and looked through the small drawer in his nightstand, where he kept things he'd accumulated and never thrown away, guitar picks from when he used to play, a St. Christopher medal that had been his father's, a birthday card I'd written him in 1987, and a folded slip of paper with 5 numbers written in his handwriting. The combination worked. Inside the lockbox was a sealed envelope with my name on it, a set of documents held with a binder clip, and a small USB drive. I opened the envelope first. His handwriting started mid-thought, the way he always talked. "You found it. Good. I always knew you would when you needed to. I should have told you all of this myself, face to face, and I'm sorry I didn't. I kept putting it off because I knew you'd argue with me about it. You would have insisted we didn't need it, that we were fine, that I was being excessive. You would have been wrong, but you would have made a compelling case. Here is what you need to know." He had been, it turned out, an extraordinarily careful man. Bernard had grown up watching his parents lose almost everything during a recession when he was 12. He had never forgotten it. For 30 years, while I ran the household on his teacher's salary and my librarian's income, he had been quietly putting money into a brokerage account I didn't know existed, not hidden from me out of dishonesty. He wrote that clearly, almost defensively, but protected from both of us, from the casual decisions and small emergencies that tend to erode savings over time. He had invested in index funds, in municipal bonds, in a small commercial property on the edge of town that he'd bought for almost nothing 20 years ago when a hardware store went under. The hardware store property was now worth considerably more than almost nothing. There was more. The condominium complex on Larkspur Drive, where my son and his wife had been living for 4 years, the one they'd chosen because it was a great investment opportunity, the one they paid $1,200 a month to rent. My husband had purchased it 12 years ago through an LLC. The management company they paid their rent to was a pass-through. The money had been going into an account in my name the entire time. My son had been paying me rent for 4 years without knowing it. I read that part 3 times. Bernard's letter continued, "I want you to use this, not to punish. You're not built for punishment, and neither am I. But if someone tries to push you out of your own life, you have the means to stand firm. I trust your judgment. I always have. Use it." I sat in that bedroom for a long time after I finished reading. The birch trees were moving in the wind outside the window. I thought about all the years I had watched Bernard at his desk on Saturday mornings, his reading glasses on, papers spread in front of him, and I had always assumed it was lesson planning or tax prep. I had brought him coffee and not asked questions because he never seemed to need anything from me except coffee. I was crying, but not the desperate kind, the overwhelmed kind. "Bernard," I said out loud, "you were so much more than I gave you credit for." The next morning, I called the number on one of the documents in the lockbox. Hartwell Financial Group, a firm in Burlington I had never heard of. The woman who answered said her name was Noreen, and when I told her who I was, she went quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Eldridge, I'm sorry I can't call you that, it's the wrong name." I told her my name, my own name. The one I'd had since I was 24 years old. Yes, she said. We've been hoping you'd call. Your husband left very specific instructions. Please come in as soon as you're able. I drove to Burlington the next day in Bernard's old Subaru. Noreen turned out to be a woman somewhere in her 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the particular calm of someone who has managed complicated situations for a long time without losing her composure. She had worked with Bernard for 16 years. She showed me statements, property records, investment summaries. She explained things slowly and repeated herself when I asked her to. She treated me like a woman who was fully capable of understanding what she was being told, which was not something I had been offered recently. The total was not a number I was prepared for. I am not one for displaying emotion in front of strangers, but I had to press my lips together very hard for a moment before I could speak. Noreen pushed a box of tissues across the desk without making it feel like a gesture. Bernard also asked me to give you this, she said, sliding over a second sealed envelope. I opened it there at her desk. The property on Larkspur Drive is yours, all of it. If our son has been a good and kind man to you, and if his wife has treated you with respect, then consider giving them a path to ownership. Terms you choose. Timeline you choose. If they have not, you know what to do. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my purse. Noreen walked me through options with the patience of someone who understood that I was still assembling pieces. She mentioned in a quiet and careful way that Bernard had also asked her to run a background check on my daughter-in-law before their marriage. I set my coffee cup down. What did he find? I asked. Nothing criminal, but a history of financial disputes, a previous relationship that ended badly after joint accounts were accessed without full consent, a pattern of attaching herself to situations with assets and leaving when the assets were secured. I thought about the glossy brochure, the craft project photographs, the woman looking at my wallpaper instead of my face. I thought about my son, who I had raised to be honest and open-hearted, who had been, before this marriage, exactly that. I drove home through the falling leaves and did not make any decisions that day. That was important. Bernard would have approved. The following Tuesday, my son arrived without his wife. He seemed surprised to find me calm. I had made tea. I asked him to sit down. I told him I had found the lockbox. He went very still. I told him what was in it, not everything, just enough. I watched his face as the information settled into him. I watched him try to reconcile the father who coached his Little League team and read him Calvin and Hobbes before bed, with the man who had quietly, carefully built a safety net large enough to hold all of us. He put his hands over his face. "Mom," he said, "I didn't know about any of this." "I believe you," I said. "I do. She told me the house was too much for you to manage. She said you needed." "What did she need?" I asked quietly. "From this house." He looked up. "The house is appraised at well above market," I said. "The neighborhood has appreciated significantly in the last 8 years. Bernard's records show offers going back 5 years that we never discussed, because Bernard declined them without telling me. He was protecting our asset, and now it's mine to protect." My son's eyes were wet. "She said it was about you, about keeping you safe." "Keeping me safe in a facility 2 hours away while this house sold and the proceeds went toward what exactly? Did she mention a number?" He looked at the table. There it was. I reached across and took his hand, and it was different from the way he had taken mine the week before. I wasn't patting, I was holding. "You are my son," I said. "You were not raised this way. I know that, and I think somewhere in you, you know that too." He started to cry, quietly, with his head bent, the way he had when he was small and had done something he was ashamed of. We talked for 3 hours. He told me things he had been afraid to say. The debt she had accumulated before they married, that he had paid without understanding the full amount. The investment she had pushed him into last year that he had not disclosed to me because she'd asked him not to. The way decisions in their home had been moving in one direction for a long time. I asked him if he loved her. He thought about it for a long time. That was the answer. He stayed for dinner. I made soup. We watched the birch trees go dark in the yard as the sun went down. And we didn't talk about what came next, because some things need one day to simply be felt. What came next arrived in the form of her attorney. My daughter-in-law had apparently been more prepared than any of us knew. Within a week of my son telling her about the lockbox, I had asked him not to. But she had a way of asking questions. She had retained counsel and sent a letter to Noreen's firm claiming that Bernard's investments had been made using commingled marital assets that should have been disclosed during my son's marriage, and that my daughter-in-law had a legal interest in the estate. Noreen called me the morning the letter arrived. She was not alarmed. She used the phrase anticipated scenario in a way that suggested Bernard had anticipated it specifically. He had. There was a third document in the lockbox, a letter to an attorney named Walter Keene in Burlington, dated 14 months before Bernard's death, establishing a trust structure that insulated the primary assets from exactly this kind of claim. Walter Keene was retired now, but his successor at the firm was a woman named Isabel. And when I called her office and said Bernard's name, she said, "We've been waiting for this call." I was beginning to understand that my husband had spent the last years of his life setting a stage for a scene he would not live to see. The legal maneuvering took 6 weeks. I won't recount every motion and counterfiling. What matters is that on a Tuesday morning in February, I walked into a conference room at Hargrove & Associates, my daughter-in-law's attorney's office, because she had requested a formal mediation meeting, and the estate attorney, a man named Terrence, who had apparently been handling her side with considerable confidence, looked up from his papers and went very, very pale. Because he knew me. Not from this dispute. From 22 years ago, when he was a junior associate at a firm in Burlington, and I was the librarian who ran the legal self-help workshop at the public library every third Thursday of the month. I had helped him find the research materials for a case that had launched his career. He had sent me a thank you card. I still had it somewhere. "That's her," he said under his breath, to no one in particular. "That's actually her." My daughter-in-law looked at him. "What?" He said, "I'll explain later," and straightened his papers, and I watched the recalibration happen behind his eyes. I sat down across from her for the first time without my son in the room between us. Without the buffer of social niceties, she looked different. Tired, maybe, or just less certain. Isabel presented our position. The trust documents were airtight. The LLC structure had been legally established and consistently maintained. There was no commingling. There was no marital interest. There was, however, a comprehensive record of the lease payments made over 4 years, payments my daughter-in-law had always handled, payments made to a company whose full corporate structure she had apparently never looked into. Terrence went still when Isabel put that document on the table. My daughter-in-law looked at me. "You owned that building the whole time?" "The whole time," I said. She looked at Terrence. He looked at his papers. The mediation lasted 2 more hours. She did not get what she came for. The house was mine. The trust was valid. The claim against the estate was withdrawn. In exchange, because Isabel, like Bernard, believed in clean exits over prolonged conflict, there was a settlement that covered reasonable relocation expenses and closed the matter completely. My son filed for divorce 3 weeks later. He moved back into the house on Larkspur Drive, which I offered him at a below-market rate, which he accepted without me having to argue about it. He started seeing a therapist, which I know because he told me, and I am proud of him for it. Some days I still stand at the kitchen window in the early morning and miss the version of events I had hoped for. I had hoped she would be the one who sat with me at holidays. I had hoped for grandchildren. I am 69 years old, and I am not immune to the ordinary grief of things not turning out the way you imagined. But grief and gratitude can share the same morning, I've learned. You don't have to choose. I have been doing a great deal with the resources Bernard left me. Not spectacular things, practical things. I endowed a small collection fund at the Millhaven Library that ensures the young adult section will never go unfunded when the budget gets tight. I helped Audra next door when her roof needed replacing, and she was too proud to ask for help. I just paid the contractor and told her it was a neighborhood fund, which was not quite true, but neither of us minds. I set up a college account for my son, which he protested and I ignored. And I started talking. This is the part Bernard would not have expected because I was always the quieter one, the one who listened more than I spoke. But I started telling my story, this story, at the library's community room on the first Wednesday of every month as part of a series I help organize for women over 50 who are navigating legal and financial situations they feel underprepared for. We talk about property rights, about estate planning, about what questions to ask and what documents to find before the crisis arrives. We talk about the ways that women of a certain age are handed brochures instead of information, are patted on the hand instead of consulted, are told what's best for them by people who have not thought carefully about what that means. Terrence, the attorney, showed up to one of those sessions. He sat in the back. Afterward, he told me he volunteers 2 hours a week now, doing free legal consultations for seniors. He said I was the reason he got into law in the first place, and that it took him long enough to act like it. I thought about what Bernard had written. You have a gift for being invisible until the exact moment it matters. He was right as usual, though I would never have said so while he was alive. There's something I want you to understand if you are watching this and you are somewhere in the middle of a story like mine, the moment when someone assumes you have nothing left to offer. When they hand you the brochure, when they set the table for two, that moment is not the end. It is information. It tells you exactly what you are working with, and if you have spent a lifetime paying attention, which most of us have, you already know more than they think. We are not invisible. We have simply been patient. Bernard used to say there are 2 ways to grow old. You can shrink toward the walls, or you can take up the space that was always yours. He said it like a choice, like something you decided. I used to think he was being philosophical. Now I understand he was being practical. I still rise before 6. I still watch the birch trees in the early light. The kettle is the same one. The blue mailbox at the end of the driveway has not moved. My son has dinner with me on Sundays, and last spring he planted a new tree in the yard, a maple, because he wanted something that would turn color in the fall. He did it without asking, just showed up with a sapling and a shovel, and worked until it was done. I watched from the porch and did not say a word about whether he was planting it in the right spot. That was a gift I was fully capable of giving. Some things, it turns out, take the whole length of a life to understand. The trick is to still be standing when you get there. I keep coming back to the morning I sat on the edge of that bed with a locked metal box in my lap and didn't know the combination. I was 69 years old and I had been married to Bernard for 45 years, and I still didn't know everything about him. That used to feel like a failure. Now it feels like proof of how much more a person can be than what we see on ordinary days. What happened to me didn't happen because of luck. It happened because of the kind of man Bernard was, a man who paid attention, who thought ahead, who understood that real love sometimes looks like a Saturday morning with reading glasses and a pile of papers that nobody else asks about. He didn't leave me money. He left me the ability to stand still in a room while other people panicked. That's a different thing entirely, and I think about the difference often. I also think about my son. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had stopped paying attention to himself, to me, to the quiet signals that something in his life had drifted. That happens to people. It happened to him. What matters is what he did once the light came back on. He sat at my kitchen table and cried without pretending he wasn't crying. He told the truth when the truth was hard. He showed up the following spring with a sapling and a shovel and didn't ask for credit. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. I used to think that being a good person was enough, that if you treated people with decency and showed up when they needed you and worked hard and kept your word, the world would more or less return the favor. I don't think that anymore. Not because the world is cruel, but because goodness without clarity is just hope, and hope without preparation is just waiting. Bernard understood that. He was the most decent man I ever knew, and he was also the most prepared. Those two things live together in him without any contradiction. What I've learned is that integrity and intelligence are not separate virtues. You need the character to do the right thing, and you need the understanding to know what the right thing actually requires. In my case, it required reading documents I had never read. It required asking questions I had been too polite to ask. It required walking into a room full of people who had already decided I was a problem to be managed, and sitting down calmly and waiting. The waiting was not passivity. That's what I want to be clear about. Patience that comes from knowing what you hold is not the same as patience that comes from having no other choice. I had a choice. I made it deliberately. That deliberateness, the willingness to stay steady when everything in the room is designed to make you feel small. That is something you build over a lifetime. It doesn't arrive all at once. It comes from every time you kept going when you wanted to stop. Every time you chose to understand a situation rather than simply react to it. Every time you acted according to what you knew was right rather than what was easiest. My son planted that maple tree without being asked. That is what I think about when I want to know if any of this was worth it. The tree is going to be beautiful in October. Bernard would have had something to say about the placement, and he would have been right, and I would have told him so eventually. That's how it goes when you've built something real.